two wonderful speakers, and Judy Schiff, one of our program committee members, is going to introduce them to you.
Thank you, Sharon. So wonderful to see you all here. Such an important evening. Very happy to have Andy and Michelle here, especially former Freedom, Iowa. Andy grew up in Marshalltown, Iowa, attended the community college there, went on to Iowa State for his Bachelor of Science degree, history, political science being some of his interests. Went on to the University of Iowa. It was nice you gave Cyclones and Hawkeyes equal time. Oh yes. And did more work on pursuing graduate work there at the University of Iowa, a master's degree in history and additional graduate work, and his doctorate then later in history from Illinois State University. He recently has retired from Highland Community College, where his primary courses that he taught were history, political science, and he was honored with the Highland Community College's Birch Memorial Award for his outstanding assistance to Highland student body. And we are just delighted to have you here tonight, Andy. And his presentation will be first. He is going to tell us a little bit about the history of these hate groups. And then our second part will be done by Michelle Sandoff. And she is a Californian, did her undergraduate work in California at the University of California, Davis. And that's where her bachelor's degree was in international relations. From there, she went on to study in the eastern part of our country at the University of Maryland, getting her master's and doctorate there, and sometime in Pennsylvania, teaching at a college there. She has been at Rockford University since this past summer, and she has always been interested in social inequalities, and she has an expertise in this, discussing diversities and talking about issues that are related to race and religion and gender and sexuality. She teaches a variety of courses, including Introduction to Sociology, Research Methods, Social Movements, LGBTQ Studies, Peace and Conflict Studies. She's written several books, chapters, articles, author of Service in a Time of Suspicion, a book that examines the experiences of Muslim service members in the U.S. military in the years after 9/11. Her work in the classroom and in the community is where she emphasizes the importance of recognizing and understanding the legacies of white supremacy that continue to impact social institutions and social inequalities. And so when she speaks tonight, she is going to try to show how white supremacy does affect the public in our elections.
Good evening. Good evening. I'm really thrilled to be here. I think this is a really important topic to be talking about. Not a super happy topic to be talking about, but really important. I'm really pleased to see that there's such community interest in talking about this really important topic. So we switch it up a little bit. I'm going to get us started with some conversations about what is going on with white supremacist and white nationalist groups in the U.S. today, particularly focusing on the drive of these movements and these groups towards the mainstream, this really intentional effort to mainstream themselves into the culture and into politics in the U.S. I will talk a little bit about how to identify, how to recognize some of the rhetoric, some of the discourse that's coming from these groups that is showing up startlingly often in the mainstream, And then I will turn it over to Andy, who will take a look at how did we get to where we are today, some of the history and the development of these movements, and their history, particularly in the U.S. Political setting. We'll try the next slide. So I want to start by distinguishing between a couple of terms that are likely to show up and are going to be really important as we think about what these movements are and what they are doing. In particular, thinking about white supremacy and then white nationalism as a particular subset of white supremacy. So white supremacy refers to an ideology, a set of movements, a set of shared beliefs that have to do with this belief in the superiority of the white racial group, and along with that, the belief that the white race should be dominant in society, culture, and politics. When we're talking about white supremacy, it really is this umbrella category that is dealing with this idea, this belief in racial superiority, and also importantly, this desire for continued white racial dominance. Wherever you're talking about, in our case, talking about the United States. White nationalism is a particular subset of white supremacy, so all white nationalists are white supremacists, not all white supremacists are white nationalists. But white nationalist is interested in segregation or separation of the races. It will look a little bit different depending on which group you're talking about, but the basic ideology here is the idea of maintaining and protecting the size of the white racial community and the purity of the white racial community through the actual separation, physically, culturally, politically, of different racial groups, particularly separating white racial groups from all other racial groups. Many white nationalist groups do explicitly seek to establish a white ethno-state or regions of the country that would function as white ethno-states. And there's a variety of different proposals depending on the group that you're talking about, but this is a pretty common goal for white nationalist groups to actually establish land, territory that you would have to be white to reside in, to be a citizen of. And as I said, what I'm going to focus on in my introduction here is talking about how these groups have begun shifting their tactics and their strategies. So what we have seen is a real decline in sort of formal membership in white supremacist and white nationalist groups. There's fewer groups than there have historically been, at least recently. There's also a fewer number of members in these groups. What we are seeing instead is not that these ideologies or these beliefs or these goals have gone away, it's that they have shifted, they have rebranded, and particularly the ways that they are rebranding is trying to mainstream, to bring themselves into the heart and soul of everyday American culture, American politics, and make themselves appealing to everyday Americans. This sort of idea of, if you think of that story of how you boil a frog by a little bit at a time, is very much that type of strategy. We're going to introduce you to something that you might find appealing, you might be willing to engage with. And as I build up that relationship, that engagement, I'm going to push you further, trying to bring you further into these sets of beliefs and these sets of goals, up to including creating a white ethno-state. So this mainstreaming has really been a key that we are seeing in the last few years among these groups. And so that is where I'm going to focus my attention. So we did want to show you this slide. So this comes from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and they track the existence of prevalence and activities of hate groups in the United States, and they issue an annual report every year. So this is the newest one that just came out. So we can see that hate groups are across the United States. They're not concentrated in one particular area. We do find them across the United States. When we look at the composition of these hate groups, the vast majority of them are white supremacists or racially motivated, racially driven in some sort of way. And 98 of them are specifically white nationalist groups, so seeking that separation, that segregation, or a distinct white ethno-state. I want to talk about a particular example that has some local ties to get a sense of what are the types of movements the SPLC is tracking, and then we'll talk about what this group and others like it are doing to bring themselves into the mainstream. So if I could get the next slide. So the particular example I want to talk to you all about is a formal group that is called the Patriot Front. They are based out of Texas, but they are active in Illinois. The three images I have for you are all examples of some of the activism, if you will, that they have engaged in recently in Illinois. So Patriot Front is a white nationalist group. They are explicitly so. If you go onto their website, which is one of their main tactics, is to drive traffic to their website. It's nice, shiny. It doesn't look white nationalist. It looks like patriotic Americana, tradition, family values. It's that type of aesthetic, that type of thing. And that is very intentional. So this group formed in 2017 following the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. And it actually split off from Vanguard America, and they split off not because they disagreed with the ideology, because they have stated they do not. They split off because they didn't like the aesthetics of Vanguard America. They felt that Vanguard America was too openly white nationalist. That was driving people away. People would look at Vanguard America and go, those are some Nazis, we don't want to be a part of that. And so Patriot Front is really intentionally, their reason for existing is to rebrand the same ideology, the same set of goals and objectives, and to make it more palatable, more mainstream as a way to recruit and bring in particularly young folks. And we see that in their online presence, we see that in their strategies of activism. And this type of work is what this group tends to do. They engage in a lot of vandalism, putting stickers, promoting and driving traffic to their website in public places. They will put flyers on college campuses. They'll drop banners. They will occasionally join into other movements. So for example, the March for Life that recently happened in Chicago, they sent out a contingent, and that's what we have the image of on the side, and they would just march alongside these other activists, trying to sort of glom on to be seen, to get their message out, to drive traffic to their website, to drive folks to check out what is this patriotic Americana group. What they are is a white nationalist group that seeks a white ethno state. But they're doing it through this very intentional rebranding and this use of an aesthetic that is meant to signal, we are just mainstream, we are normal, we are safe, come learn with us, but what you will learn with them is white supremacy. They are, as active in Illinois, doing this type of stuff. They have also been demonstrated in Chicago an estimated 10 times since they were formed in 2017. And each one of those demonstrations is highly orchestrated to look good on camera, to look good on social media, to look good on their website. And they have branches all across the United States doing this type of work. Okay. And Patriot Front is a really great example of how these movements are shifting. As they're moving away from sort of the image we often think of when we think of white supremacy and white nationalists, the KKK, the hoods, the burning crosses. These groups are moving away from that explicit, obvious symbolism, and they're moving towards this mainstreaming, we're just like you, come talk with us type of movement. And one of the ways that these groups do this is through the use of what we often call dog whistles. So dog whistling, or using dog whistles, the idea of using symbols or references or phrases that if you're in the know, you know exactly what's being said. And if you're not in the know, it doesn't sound particularly objectionable. Tell me more. Okay? And so one of the things I like to focus on when I talk about white nationalists and white supremacist groups in the US is what are some of these dog whistles. Because once you know them, once you become an informed audience, you will see them, you will hear them, you will recognize them far more commonly than you probably think they are there. And it is also extremely important to be able to recognize them, to be able to understand, to decode what is being said and what the unspoken pieces are, whether that's for yourself or other folks in your life who are being exposed to these messages in ways that are not explicit or not blamed, but are very effective. And so there are a lot of dog whistles. I want to draw our attention to just a few of them, some of the most common ones that we're going to see at sort of this particular moment. Ideas around replacement. Sometimes it's called the great replacement, sometimes it's called replacement theory, sometimes just talking about replacement will be the dog whistle here. And this is the idea, the fear, it's explicitly white nationalist in nature, but this fear that the white race is being replaced by non-white populations. Sometimes this manifests in fears about birth rates, right? Or about immigration. Right? When you think back to the Unite the Right rally, the chant, we will not be replaced, I will paraphrase that. That's a dog whistle. Anyone who's familiar with this theory knows exactly what is being referenced. Right? And again, it becomes this way to bring in someone who doesn't already know the rhetoric, to bring them in, to get them asking more questions, and to engage them in this conversation. Okay? Another key one that's very popular right now is what's referred to as the 14 words, which refers to this specific phrase that I have up here on the board: we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. And this one shows up a lot. Sometimes it shows up in the numbers. 14, particularly when combined with 88. That is a white supremacist dog whistle. 14 for the 14 words, 88 for Heil Hitler. Right, 88, H is the 8 letter in the alphabet. So on things like social media, someone has a bio and it has 1488. Again, if you don't know what that means, great, this is a person on social media. But anyone who's looking to reach out or make friends with white supremacists, they know very clearly that is what is going on there. And you see that a lot on social media in these different places where you're communicating with someone else who knows the code. In more mainstream, particularly mainstream political discourse, this phrase probably feels fairly familiar, right? The idea, the sentiment, shows up a lot in mainstream political discourse, in mainstream media discourses. It is evoking this idea, right? Conversations, rhetoric, discourse around saving, particularly saving white babies, creating space for white babies. That's that, turning up the heat in that pot, bringing folks into the conversation without them realizing that what they are being sort of exposed to is white supremacy, explicit, blatant white supremacy. But if you don't know, sure, let's have this conversation. Another common one we'll see today is appeals to Western civilization, posing sort of an us-them, the civilized West versus the uncivilized East, the uncivilized other. That shows up pretty prominently in our popular culture discourse. That is also a red flag to be paying attention to, because very often it is, again, turning up that notch on the pot of water with the frog in it. It is attempting to bring folks into a conversation that will lead pretty directly to white supremacy and white nationalism without appearing to start there. So these are what I would characterize as being the three most common ones currently. Obviously it shifts and changes, there's trends in all of this, as with everything in society. But these are some examples of what I'm talking about, the attempts to mainstream these movements, these ideologies. And then finally, and so we want to pay attention to the various ways that these movements, these ideologies are seeking to find a pathway into the mainstream and are succeeding in finding a pathway into the mainstream. They're redirecting energies away from sort of the separate insular groups towards having these conversations, trying to awaken white identity among the general population, trying to recruit new members, whether that is online, through a process that's often referred to as red pilling, or whether that's in person through talking, through events, through political debates, through media interviews. And once we recognize that mainstreaming is one of the major pathways that these groups and these ideologies are seeking to take today, it opens up a variety of questions. It allows us to think critically about a lot of what is going on in our culture and in our politics, specifically right now. The ways in which particularly topics that are deemed cultural war controversial topics can be and are being used by white supremacist and white nationalist movements to bring folks into the conversation. Can I get you to engage or to think about or to be afraid of critical race theory? Can I get you to engage with or be afraid of non-traditional gender roles? Can I bring you into a piece of the conversation, someone who will support these messages when they hear them from mainstream politicians? And it is all very insidious because it is not explicit in the way that we often assume that white supremacy and white nationalism is going to be. It's fairly clear if you know the code, if you know what to look for, right? And it is much more mainstream than certainly I'm comfortable with. And that is what makes it so insidious. So in the next one, I'm going to turn it over to Andy, who's going to take us through the history and the development, how to get to this place where we are today.
Thank you, and thanks Michelle for the introduction. Pretty much what I think Michelle summarized was that hate, a major component of hate is fear, and there are always demagogues around to exploit the two, the fear of the other. Excuse me. Religion and race and ethnicity have always been kind of the basis for hate groups in this country. In fact, even in colonial America, the effects of the Protestant Reformation was still very culturally strong. So Catholicism, there were very few Roman Catholics in the colonies, but a hatred or fear of Roman Catholicism was already strong before the United States was born. Now in the 1790s, the first two political parties formed, the Federalists and the Jeffersonians, were the Democratic Republicans. And by 1798, the Federalists noticed that immigrants coming to this country, and there weren't that many at that time, but the immigrants that did come tended to become Jeffersonians. That's right? Oh, sorry. That was too loud. Okay, louder. All right. So anyway, there was this fear that immigrants tended to become Jeffersonians. So the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed in 1798 that increased the period of naturalization for citizens from 5 to 14 years, and also it provided for the arrest and possible imprisonment for criticizing the U.S. government. Well, clearly, I mean, that was a violation of the Bill of Rights. And the Federalists actually wrote their death warrant by passing this legislation. They lost the election of 1800 and never controlled the government again after that. So popular pressures did them in. Now, ironically, there were very few immigrants coming to the country. In fact, the largest immigrant group coming to the country were Africans through the slave trade at that time. Okay, next please. Okay, after 1820, immigration to the United States increased considerably, and especially large numbers of Irish and German immigrants came. By the 1840s, this was becoming quite heavy, with the Irish coming mainly because of the potato famine in the mid-1840s, and large numbers of Germans came after the failed revolutions of 1848. This included, of course, large numbers of Roman Catholics coming here. And there was this increasing rhetoric about the Pope was plotting to take over the United States through these immigrants. And also you see the stereotypes there of the Irish and the German immigrant as well. Next. The violence against these immigrants and the Catholic Church increased. In fact, the first overt act of violence against Catholics was the burning of the convent in Charleston, Massachusetts in 1834. And there were several other Catholic churches that were burned. There were clashes between nativists and especially the Irish in places like Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston as well. The Irish in particular were singled out mainly because the United States was a society at that time that was pretty much run by English Americans. So there was already this hostility between the English domination over the Irish at that time. Next, please. Now, in 1849, a secret organization was formed known as the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. And this group was highly secretive. In fact, their secretive nature actually attracted a lot of members because of the imagery that, okay, we're going to join a secret society. And of course, secret societies were relatively popular in the United States at that time anyway, the Masons and other groups. Now, the members were ordered that if people asked them questions about this organization, they were to respond, "I know nothing." So therefore, unfortunately for them in the long run, they became known as the know-nothings. That's probably not a good marketing technique overall, but anyway, that's what they did. Now, by 1854, the political party system was breaking up, or at least the current political party system, between the Democrats and the Whig Party. The Whig Party was breaking apart because the southern and northern wings of the party had a hard time staying together. So those voters were kind of up for grabs for a while in the mid-1850s. And the two new parties that were competing for these voters was the new Republican Party, which focused on race and the slavery issue, and what became known as the American Party. The Know Nothings kind of morphed into the American Party, which tried to focus on immigration and anti-Catholic feeling. In fact, there were a lot of Know Nothings that believed they could save the nation by changing the subject from slavery and racism to bigotry toward European immigrants, particularly the Irish and the Germans. So that was their strategy. There was a lot of success for the American Party in 1854 and 1855. In fact, early on, it appeared like the American Party was going to be the successor second party for a while. They controlled many state legislatures. They held a balance of power in the House and the Senate for a while. And in 1856, they ran a presidential candidate, former President Millard Fillmore. And in fact, this is also the first election in which the Republicans ran a national candidate too. John C. Fremont, excuse me, who put together, the Republicans put together probably one of the great political slogans in American history. Their slogan was, free soil, free men, and Fremont. Not bad. Now, unfortunately for the American Party, the immigration issue was fading by 1856, and the country's attention was returning to race. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had been passed. There was bleeding Kansas by this time. And in the election, Fillmore ended up running a fairly strong third. He did particularly well in the border areas. He only carried the state of Maryland, got about 22% of the vote. And you can see that the Republican Party was very much a sectional party. Only the vast majority of their votes were in New York. Next. By 1860, slavery and race was very much the focus again. And again, you can see the divisions in the country where the Republicans were almost exclusively the Northern Party. The old American Party was kind of succeeded by the Constitutional Union Party. And again, you can see that they ran pretty well in the border areas. But the American Party was all but dead by that time. So race had again replaced bigotry toward immigrants by this time. Next, please. Of course, the election of 1860 brought on the Civil War, and the Civil War brought on the end of slavery. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865 officially ended slavery. And there was some hope in the early Reconstruction period that some sort of racial justice might prevail. There was actually voting rights for black males by 1870. The 15th Amendment tried to guarantee that. Equal protection under the law in 1868 with the 14th Amendment. There was also the Freedmen's Bureau, which was an agency that was run by the U.S. Army basically in the South, that tried to bring some equity to the racial situation in the South. So there was some hope. In fact, in 1868, in the presidential election of 1868, there's considerable evidence that the 600,000 or 700,000 African Americans who voted in the South in 1868 may very well have made the difference in electing Ulysses Grant and keeping the Republicans in power. So they were becoming a political force to contend with by that time. Next, please. By 1872, there was a substantial black congressional delegation, 2 United States senators, 5 U.S. House members that were African American. Those types of numbers were not going to be met again for over 100 years. There was a real fear among many white Southerners that their power was never going to be restored. That African Americans and their white allies in the South would control, particularly the Deep South. Because in the border South, African Americans made up maybe 15 or 20, 25% of the population. In the Deep South, it was more like 40 or 45%. And in Mississippi and South Carolina, African Americans were actually the majority of the population. So there was a real fear that whites would never regain control. Of course, the situation at the time was that in most of these former Confederate states, the U.S. Army occupied these states, and the state governments had to answer to the general in that district. Now, in the border South, eventually, whites just simply voted themselves back into office. In the Deep South, though, they turned to terrorism to regain control. And in 1866, the Ku Klux Klan was created first as supposedly a veterans organization, Confederate veterans organization. Its leader was Nathan Bedford Forrest, Confederate general. By 1869 or so, they were beginning to terrorize various political leaders in the Deep South, either African Americans or their allies. And next, please. There was intimidation. People would be visited, let's say, on a Monday before an election, a Sunday night or a Monday, and pretty much made clear to African Americans and their allies that if you go to vote on Tuesday, we'll be back on Wednesday and you'll be dead. Now, that didn't intimidate everyone, but it did tamp down the numbers enough so that full white Southern control finally came back in the Deep South. Now, President Grant, to his credit, did enforce the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, which, by the way, is still on the books. It makes it illegal to obscure your identity in the commission of a felony. They make it a federal crime. But still, the basic purpose of the Klan was achieved in bringing about white supremacy again. What finally ended Reconstruction was the disputed election of 1876. The Republicans had been in control of the government for 12 or 14 years by the early 1870s. And there was some corruption involved in their governments. Also, the panic of 1873 struck. It was a very serious recession, which the Republicans were blamed for. And by 1876, it was assumed that the Democrats would regain control of the presidency. Samuel Tilden was the Democratic nominee. Rutherford Hayes of Ohio was a Republican nominee. And you can see that in the results, I hope you can see, that actually Tilden won the popular vote by about 250,000. Although there were three disputed southern states, Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, where each party sent in their own set of popular vote returns showing that their candidate had won. Well, finally, Congress created an electoral commission to look into this, and it finally voted 8-7 to award the election to Hayes. Well, the Democrats were, fit to be tied over this, and they even threatened to reopen the Civil War again in some quarters. Finally, there was a meeting that was held in which the compromise was, in early 1877, that if the Democrats would allow Hayes to occupy the presidency, the Republicans would agree to remove the remaining federal troops in the South and end Reconstruction. Excuse me. So that was pretty much what was done by May of 1877. And quite often, it's been said that the North won the war, but the South won the peace in the long run. And for the next 75 to 80 years, the South really kind of dominated the discussion over the Civil War. It became a lost cause, and somehow it was just a conflict. It was a misunderstanding between two groups of white people that put a little bit different spin on democracy. You know, that's what the issue was. And that allowed the Jim Crow system to develop, grow into place, and actually dominate much of the country. The South certainly, but also in the North as well. On the West Coast, there was another version of, I guess you could say, racism. There was this anti-Chinese movement, and which culminated in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. There were never very many Chinese in the United States until the gold rush in 1849, which began attracting many Chinese. At the same time, there was overcrowding in southeastern China, so there were Chinese, mainly Chinese males that came to California to search for their fortune. And the Chinese did go to the gold fields, but they also staffed and owned many service industries. The association of the laundry and the Chinese, of course, comes from that. And they also were instrumental in building the western end of the Transcontinental Railroad, the first Transcontinental Railroad. Now, white labor worried about the competition from the Chinese. The Chinese tended to be sober, save their money, work together, and of course, those qualities were not welcome. And of course, racism on top of that. There were anti-Chinese riots on the West Coast. And finally, this led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which is actually the first piece of legislation Congress ever passed, which stigmatized one group of people to restrict their immigration. At first, there was only a 10-year immigration ban on the Chinese. In 1902, that was made permanent. And that was going to last until the 1940s. Next, please. Now, a number of years later, a new wave of anti-immigration bigotry and also racism reared its ugly head again. A lot of it was triggered by the film Birth of a Nation, which was released in 1915. It was really as far as cinematography, it was a real milestone, but it was just thoroughly racist. I mean, it glorified, I don't know how many of you have ever seen Birth of a Nation, but it of course, portrayed African-American males as rapists and made out their white allies as being either naive or venal in some sort of way. And of course, it glorified the Ku Klux Klan. The argument made was that the only way that Southern civilization could be saved was to regain control of the political and military situation in the South. And of course, the Klan was the way to do it. The film was screened in the White House. President Wilson declared that it was like writing history with lightning. He was just enthralled with the film. And this really kind of jump-started the second Ku Klux Klan. And William Simmons was the founder of the second Klan, although he was not a particularly good leader or marketer, and he eventually lost control of the Klan. And this time it was really not a secret society like it was during Reconstruction, except at the higher echelons. There was really a major campaign to recruit members after about 1920 into the organization as kind of just a community organization, like the Elks or the Moose or the Masons or whatever else. It was considered to be a perfectly acceptable organization to join. The second Klan used modern marketing methods. Eventually, Hiram Evans became the Imperial Wizard. He and a group of kind of savvy marketeers kind of took the organization away from William Simmons. And this time the Klan was not only anti-black, but it was also anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anti-intellectual, and was opposed to what they would call non-Anglo-Saxon or Nordic immigration. And they kept reminding their potential followers that the United States was no longer a melting pot, it had become a garbage can. And something had to be done about this. Of course, a lot of the animus toward immigration was triggered by the First World War, also European problems and that sort of thing as well. There was also the eugenics movement, which was really riding high at that time. This pseudo-scientific field that argued that there were intellectual and moral characteristics that could be discovered because of a person's race. That was quite strong at the time also. The Klan, estimates of Klan membership may have been as high as 3 to 6 million by the mid-1920s. The Klan, the image that we have today is that the Klan was particularly strong in small towns and rural areas, and they were. But more and more research has shown that they were every bit as strong in a lot of metropolitan areas as well. Because that's where a lot of the immigration, new immigration, was coming. So, okay, next please. Now the Klan also claimed to support family values, prohibition, traditional Protestantism, although there was a lot of hypocrisy in the Klan, and that's really going to bring about its demise. Next, please. There were at least 5,500 people lynched in the United States between 1880 and 1940. At least those are the numbers that we know of. It was probably considerably higher than that. And 90% of those lynchings were of African Americans. In the lower right-hand corner there, this is the NAACP flag that was flown every day. An African American was lynched. Well, anybody was lynched, I think, but particularly African Americans were lynched. The Klan was quite powerful. At the 1924 Democratic Convention, a vote to condemn the Klan failed by one vote at the convention. So, and you saw kind of a division developing in the Democratic Party between the white Southern Protestant wing of the party and the northern, urban, more ethnic, Catholic wing of the party was emerging by the 1920s, which is going to continue really until the 1960s or so. Okay, next. There were a number of social activities that the Klan participated in, and there was widespread acceptance. You can see in Texas, there's Ku Klux Klan Day at the State Fair, but also as far north as Indianola, Iowa, we have a Ku Klux Klan Fair Day at the Orange County Fair as well. In Illinois, although there was also opposition, particularly in the urban areas where Eastern European immigrants, Southern European immigrants in particular, didn't care for what the Klan was trying to do either. So you saw these conflicts within organizations like the UAW between the new immigrants from Southern Eastern Europe versus the more nativist elements. Next, please. Now, the Klan's greatest achievement, in the 1920s, was that they were instrumental in bringing about strict immigration restriction. In 1921, an immigration law was passed which restricted immigration to 3% a year of the ethnic groups that were represented in society in the 1910 census. 3 years later, another law was passed further restricting that to 2% of the ethnic makeup in 1890. Of course, it went back 20 years because in 1890, there was much more predominance of Northwestern European Protestants as opposed to Southern and Eastern European Catholics and Jews and so forth. Finally, toward the end of the 20s, another immigration law just restricted immigration to 150,000 people a year. And again, this Northwestern European bias continued. It's interesting that between the 1920s and 1960s, the demographic makeup of the United States changed very little because of that. So the melting pot comes to an end next week. You can see some of the shifts in immigration. Now, what started to cause the Klan to wane toward the second half of the 20s was a lot of scandals associated with the Klan, a lot of internal greed, moral hypocrisy. G.C. Stevenson, he was the imperial wizard of the Indiana Klan. In fact, the Klan pretty much ran Indiana politics for several years. He was arrested for kidnapping his secretary, raping her, and then poisoning her. So this kind of fooled people on Klan, I guess. I mean, people do have standards, I guess. Next, please. Now, the Klan was instrumental in helping along another event, and this was the presidential election of 1928. Excuse me, 1928, Governor L. Smith of New York was the Democratic Party nominee, and he was the first Roman Catholic ever nominated by a major party in U.S. history. And his opponent was Herbert Hoover. Now, Hoover was going to win anyway. The Republican Party was the clear majority party in the country in the 1920s. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But the Klan in particular made it a point of not taking any chances and making sure that Smith didn't have a chance. In fact, one of their slogans was, "The Catholic can't come within gunshot of the White House." And there are all kinds of rumors that a tunnel was being built to accommodate the Pope's White House visits if Smith became president. There was a lot of hypocrisy on prohibition. Smith was known as a wet. He wanted to end prohibition, and Hoover and the Republicans ran as dry. Well, apparently Hoover, as Secretary of Commerce, whenever he felt really thirsty, he went over to the British Embassy and had a drink. That kind of took care of that. When Smith campaigned in Oklahoma, there were burning crosses that greeted Smith's train. About every 200 yards along the side of the tracks was a burning cross, reminding him that he was not wanted there. Next, please. And here's the results of the election. Smith even lost a good deal of the border south, which the Democrats usually carried, mainly because a lot of white Southerners preferred having a Republican as president to a Catholic. So that was the end of that. And Smith, when he was asked what his reaction was, he said, "I guess the time hasn't come yet when a man can say his beads in the White House." And this was a prelude to the Kennedy race in 1960, of course. A lot of people still remember this 1928 race as far as Catholicism is concerned. Next, please. Okay, move ahead a couple of decades. We have the Great Depression, World War II, which distracts a lot of people. By the late 1940s, though, a new Red Scare was developing, fear of communism. Joe McCarthy became kind of the face of what came to be known as McCarthyism, although of course a lot more widespread than this. And McCarthy actually had a pretty good run of several years, kind of dominating the news. Although early in the Eisenhower administration, Eisenhower finally gave the green light to kind of putting the curb on McCarthy. which showed that the Republican Party still had standards in those days. Well, they did. They actually did. I mean, that type of thing was just too much. So, now, this also brings up the John Birch Society, which also emerged in the early 1950s. It was named after poor John Birch, who was actually a liberal Democrat, but he was the first American soldier to die in Korea. So the John Birch Society took his name because this symbolized their fight against communism, right? Since he was the first. Actually, I guess John Birch's family sued the John Birch Society, but they were able to keep the name. And the John Birch Society just became pathological in their so-called fight against communist Mexicans. Here are some of the billboards that the Birch Society was responsible for. Of course, impeaching Earl Warren was a big movement among the Klan and the John Birch Society, as well as others. This poster that Martin Luther King is supposedly shown at the Communist Training School here. And of course, getting out of the United Nations was a major position of the John Birch Society. This poster about President Kennedy wanted for treason, that appeared in the Dallas newspapers the day that he was assassinated, and accused him of colluding with communists and being guilty of treason and so forth. Next, please. William Buckley actually was instrumental in blocking the John Birch Society from kind of infiltrating mainstream conservatism. And he's given a lot of credit for that. It wasn't just Buckley working alone, but there were other conservatives that would not allow the John Birch Society to become a part of their movement. And again, conservatism had high standards at that time as well. Next, please. Now, the Civil Rights Movement, which of course was emerging at the same time after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, although I mean it was there before then, but it became a focus after that. You had all these groups that questioned the Civil Rights Movement, certainly the Klan, also the neo-Nazis, which emerged after World War II, the white citizens' councils around the South as well. The John Birch Society made the argument that communists had infiltrated the Civil Rights Movement as well. As far as the neo-Nazis are concerned, their leader was George Lincoln Rockwell. I don't know if some of you may remember George Lincoln Rockwell. He was assassinated in 1967. But you're starting to see a lot of these hate groups kind of proliferate, become more specialized in their hatreds by this time. Next, please. And then there's Alabama Governor George Wallace, who really rode the white backlash of the mid to late 1960s to national prominence. There was kind of a white backlash against the Civil Rights Movement, even more so the Black Power movement, which kind of emerged in the second half of the 1960s. And George Wallace decided that white fear of racial change in the country was something that could bring him to power. Also, he became the first major critic of the United States government as a tax and spend, they're telling you how to live, sort of candidate, which is very typical today. In 1963, in his inaugural address as governor of Alabama, he gave his famous segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever speech, in which he made his views known. And later that year, he famously stood in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama to prevent black students from being registered. He stepped aside, of course, after making his dramatic appearance. Next, please. By 1968, he formed a third party, the American Independent Party, ran for president, and actually won about 10 million votes. He carried 5 southern states, and pretty much became kind of a hardcore racial candidate. Law and order became his slogan, just as Richard Nixon used it as well. But Nixon was kind of the more acceptable, moderate conservative candidate as opposed to Wallace. Although Nixon came to realize that if he was able to attract a majority of the Wallace voters, the Republican Party would become the new majority party in the country. And in some ways, he was successful after 1968. That kind of brings us to a more contemporary situation. We have this fear and hate tradition that continues. The first example is the Tea Party, which kind of emerged around 2008. There were basically 3 ingredients that caused the Tea Party to emerge. The rapid demographic changes to the country. The country was becoming increasingly non-white by 2008. Also, the election of Barack Obama, which just scared the living hell out of a lot of whites who were pretty much told that blacks were always going to be at the bottom of the totem pole. And here they were at the top. And then, of course, the Great Recession was mixed into all that as well. Next, please. And then the second example, of course, is Trumpism, which really, in some ways, grew out of the Tea Party movement and some other movements as well. Trump's advantage was that he was able to win a major party presidential nomination, where George Wallace never was able to do that. In fact, sometimes Donald Trump is referred to as the Yankee George Wallace, because many of Wallace's themes became Trump's themes. The federal government is your enemy, there's this deep state plotting against you, the government's going to tell you who can live next door to you. Racism, kind of a dog whistle, kind of racism. Now, Trumpism also benefited from the new generation of marketing technology, television, social media. Were able to bring together dozens of hate groups, and many of which were endorsed Trump, including the Ku Klux Klan. So what we have now is kind of a new wave of know-nothingism. The Republican Party, unfortunately, has gone from being the party which ended slavery to maybe 50 years ago, the party which winked and nodded to bigots sometimes, to a new American party, really. Anti-immigration, anti-black, anti-internationalism, and so forth. And here's Trump and some of his supporters, both at home and abroad. Next. So, the tradition continues, although in some ways it's more dangerous than ever before. Now this movement dominates one of the 2 major political parties. The movement is devoted to lying and cheating, blocking voting rights as well, assaults on government. And they've terrified Republican office holders, many of whom don't believe in what they're doing. But this fear of being primaried by Trumpism keeps them in line. And you have a lot of right-wing media support of this movement as well. And a large slice of the electorate willing to tolerate all of this. And keep in mind that in 2020, after 4 years of Donald Trump, he almost won again. He got almost 47% of the vote in 2020. So, and of course, as Michelle Avery pointed out, we have all these hate groups. I mean, there's so many hate groups to choose from today. What's a bigot to do? I mean, there's so much to choose from. It's like you've got these little niche markets instead of one or two or three organizations. So, anyway, thank you very much. I'm sorry?
I was just asking Michelle if she wanted another chance.
One thing that stood out to me, which is really interesting, when you're talking about the wanting to return to the demographics of the 1910s and the 1890s. It's the same goal, a lot of these white nationalist groups, they want to return to the demographic composition of the U.S. in the 1950s before immigration was allowed again from places other than Europe, and that's one of the, just the way you can see the patterns, they just, right, it's nothing new, it keeps showing up whatever the new costume is, but it's the same.
Yeah, it's the same.
Same strategy.
Same characters.
Are there any questions we have? I was just before we start asking those, everybody look at the clock. We have to be out of here completely by 8. So we usually try to cut off at 1:45. So if we, that would give us 10 minutes for questions now. So be succinct. Okay, go ahead.
Stand up. Or,
Sarah?
no?
I need the definition for pronatalism.
It's movements that encourage births. So like pronatalism is pro increases in fertility, and particularly pro-life natalism.
So that would be also anti-abortion.
Yes, yes. Go hand in hand.
Gail?
In the very beginning, you showed a slide that showed the country and hate groups that were by Southern Christian Leadership Conference. There were two. It looked like one was in Stevenson County and one was in Greene County, Wisconsin. I'd like to know what those two groups are.
I don't have them off the top of my head, but if you pull up the website, it's completely interactive. You just click on them and it'll tell you who they are. Yeah.
Okay. Are you familiar with the group called the Christian Women of America?
I've heard them. I've heard them.
Concerned Christian Women. I think it's based here, part of it's based here. It fits that. I just wanted to get that one.
They were one of the major groups that sponsored the January 6th thing.
That's why I think.
I feel as though I would be missing a marketing opportunity. If I did not point out to you that there is a brochure that gives information and membership forms about becoming a member of the Freeport branch of the NAACP.
Any other questions? I don't know how hard it would be to go back to the slide at the beginning that you showed with some of those terms that we should be alert to, the dog whistle terms in that. That would, there were a lot of things to read, and you were telling us a lot of things so quickly there, and I think that is, if you would have any recommendation to us to leave us with, what would be the biggest thing that you could do other than infiltrate one of these groups? I could screw up the internet technology.
There we go.
Really.
Ruin the hashtags. I'm an educator, so my bias is going to go almost always back to education. Because I think the more people are aware of and can decode this language, the less power it has as a dog whistle. Because I want to say most people would not support white supremacy. I don't think that's quite true, but many people would be deeply distressed with the idea that they are being recruited into a white nationalist or a white supremacist group. The power of these groups is that they get people in the door before they realize that that's what it is, and they sort of bring them in, and by the time you're in, you've been convinced by the arguments you've been brought in by the flashy graphics and the rhetoric, and suddenly all of these things that would have seemed completely impossible before, they just make some sense, and that is really dangerous for society. That's where we get to things like what the electoral map in 2020 looked like. That wasn't a one-time thing. That was this slow progression, a slow feeding and bringing people into these narratives, these claims, making sense to them, right? Desensitizing. And so I think education, being aware, being able to decode this, being able to recognize it, being able to call it out, because it is all around us. It's on the TV, particularly cable news. When we turn that on, there's a a lot of this, but it's also very prevalent in the digital space, and a lot of these groups are dedicating a lot of their resources in the digital space to trying to get Gen Zs, millennials, Gen Z, they'll be heading for Gen Alpha as soon as they get online as well, bringing them in before they know what white supremacy is, bringing them into that fold, and indoctrinating them into that fold.
You.
Looking at the SPLC annual report, which you drew a map from, but they have many more groups with different names and so forth. It's just amazing how many, this is simplified a
Yes.
great deal compared to how many different groups there are with different purpose and names and so forth.
And these thoughts are places where they sort of have specifically identified a headquarters or a chapter. There's many more groups that have a presence, either statewide or just more of a cultural presence in the region that don't make a dot on the map, but they're making an impact on the culture.
And I suppose that 733 maybe captures all the groups, if I,
So that's all of their identified groups.
yeah.
Yeah.
It seems to me that some of the questions given to our new Supreme Court nominee have some of these
Yes.
dog whistles in them.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
so it is really mainstream.
It is really mainstream. Yeah.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Are you familiar with, I heard this on NPR, and it's been probably a couple of years ago, a study that was done determining what might have impacted younger kids, in particular men, to end up being attracted to a hate group. And it frequently seemed that something had happened to them where they felt belittled. Have you?
That's one of the big tactics that a lot of these groups and these movements are going to use to bring in or try to recruit folks, is to argue, and often they are targeting younger white men, is often the go-to demographic, that you are being oppressed. You have lost out, you are not guaranteed the same success that your fathers, your grandfathers were guaranteed. And that is across the board, so that's going to be tying into things like the Great Recession, right? But it's also going to be tying to things like changing gender norm. Oh, you can't get a date, it's because society is oppressing you, and come join our group, we'll make you feel included. It is really intentionally targeting and making particular demographics who have historically been very privileged feel that increases in inequality are actually oppression against them, and using that rhetoric really intentionally to bring in specific demographics. Yeah.
And misogyny too, which hasn't
Misogyny.
been mentioned, but that's a part of this.
Absolutely. Ideas about traditional gender roles, misogyny, patriarchy, also anti-LGBTQ movements. Those are not unrelated to all of this. These pieces are all connected together. However you get the person in through the door, and then you start indoctrinating them further and further, more extreme, more extreme.
Go ahead.
Are there any organized groups that mission statement or their mission is to expose this or bring national attention to these specific groups?
SPLC.
The SPLC is going to be the biggest one, the Southern Poverty Law Center, with their annual report. The ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, also does a lot of tracking, a lot of information. They've got a really great website for sort of what are some of the visual symbols, some of the rhetoric that's being used. They've got a database that you can pull, like, that tattoo looks suspicious, let me see if it's white supremacist. ADL's website can tell you. So those are going to be the two big players.
To read that annual report is very informative, a lot of information about these groups and, yes, as you described.
And we see them sort of fighting on that same digital terrain as well. The SPLC's website it's flashy, you click on things, it'll take you right to the information. It is set up to try to sort of debunk, to provide those, that fact-checking almost in the same sort of style that the young people are being exposed to on the white supremacist side.
I know the Southern Poverty Law Center, they've taken many of these groups to court. And in fact, bankrupted some of them.
It is really worth their while to log on to their website. And even join, send them a small donation, and you get their magazine. And they also give away to teachers lots of free videos that are put together, condensed condensations of a lot of things that are going on there. They're so supportive and genuine.
I was just wondering if the ACLU or someone else was doing something about this, surely. You think?
They are, there's also the Human Rights Watch, the Brennan Center, I think does a lot of work too.
The what?
The Brennan, it's named after William Brennan, the Supreme Court Justice.
Oh, okay.
They do a lot of work along those lines too. Yes, the NAACP?
Anybody have a 30-second question? Otherwise, we want to thank you so much.